All right, and we are live with this stream with Todd Lewis and Dave the Distributist, and we will be talking Moldbug today. I'm going to be revisiting Moldbug for the first time in a long time on this channel, and we're going to be coming at this from a very critical perspective. Unfortunately, we could not have Closington on this stream as he was disengaged from it at the last minute, but that's fine. So if you're not familiar with what we're doing here, Praise of Folly, or Todd Lewis here, has his own YouTube channel that'll be linked in the description. And he has been doing a series called, what was it called?
Escaping the Moldbug Matrix.
Yeah, that was it. Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. And of course, this stream's title is a pun on that. And basically, he's been rereading all of Yarvin's work from the original Unqualified Reservations blog. And you've done 17 parts now with your co-host Logos. And this has been very interesting stuff. It's been very interesting for me to see a new, fresh perspective on Yarvin. So much longer after a lot of the rest of us got into him. So you're sort of brand new to Yarvin, and I found your criticisms really interesting. Now, for people who don't follow me elsewhere, I'm not exactly. I'm pretty much on board with a lot of your criticisms of Yarvin, which is especially why I wanted to have Dave and Closington on the stream, especially Dave, because I think he'll provide the most balanced approach to your criticisms. And I know you have a lot of questions as well about like why people like this guy in the first place. And as it happens, we're both programmers as well, and that's going to factor into this quite a lot. I was hoping Closington could bring in his blue collar perspective, but you have a lot more to read, so maybe we can do another stream in the future. So, with that out of the way, let me preempt some things I know you're interested in. So, thing you said that was interesting is like why do people like this guy at all? And for myself and a lot of the people who have watched my videos and Dave's videos, Moldbug was sort of our first, like, you could say, heavyweight introduction to political philosophy. And for a lot of us as well, right, we're in the same career basically as him, which is the technical industry. So given those two things, you're liable to sort of look past a lot of the issues that you might encounter with someone, because you get a little bit enthralled, when someone introduces you to something really interesting the first time. And one of the really interesting statements I heard you make on your podcast is how people tend to give Yarvin a lot of the benefit of the doubt where they really shouldn't. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So before I hand it off to either of you, my perspective on Moldbug right now is if you imagine a Venn diagram with your two circles, one of them's the left, one of them's the right, and they overlap somewhere in the middle. If you took like a rubber band from the inside of the left circle and you stretched it all the way as far as it could to the right, even in that zone where they intersect, but it still didn't quite exit that left wing circle. That's kind of where I view Moldbug right now. So that's just my perspective, and I'll hand it over to you two. Dave, do you have anything to say on the introduction before we hand it to Todd?
Well, I'll put it this way. I mean, I read Moldbug back in the original UR days, and I kind of dismissed him as a kook. The thing is, first of all, and we need to get this off the table. I'm sure there's lots of valid criticisms, like he writes in an irritating way, or he speaks in an incoherent way with a lot of ums. I think we can dismiss all that. And Morgoth hates the way he writes, and that's totally fine. I understand that. I understand his writing style could be very irritating for people because it either clicks with you or it doesn't. I'll put this about Moldbug's appeal. And I actually had read a bunch of Sam Francis essays, and this is way back in like what was it, 2008 or something. 2009 was kind of leaving the progressive plantation. And the difficulty is that with all of these sort of stodgy paleocons, they were very easy to dismiss as sort of bitter clingers to an old order and not actually engaging with sort of new, exciting ideas that came out of Silicon Valley. And the way Yarvin approached these ideas was to sort of translate the sort of and then even when they come up in San Francisco, he's basically taking them from Burnham and Mosca and Pareto. These are incredibly non-original ideas, but what Moldbug was very, very good at doing was translating these ideas that were so easy to dismiss because they came to us in sort of either colloquial, sort of provincial language or from sort of a long time ago. And he translated them into the language of Silicon Valley, and to put it bluntly. And because of that, he's like, okay, well, we have these problems here in Blue America, and guess what's playing out? What's playing out is not the marketplace of ideas. What's playing out is this sort of elite theory. What's playing out is this classical sense of politics. And, he was able to really, and this is something that's not so valuable for Todd, he very accurately captures the sort of, I have these irritating eccentricities about the progressive blue state mind, especially of the progressive California blue state mind. And he shows how it sort of how it diluted itself into imagining real power politics as sort of its own progressive form of progressivism. And, that was the missing piece for me. It's like, if that piece isn't there, my understanding of American politics, it feels like, okay, this might be something that's true in the abstract, but how does it apply to me here? But with that little missing piece, as trivial as it might seem in the abstract, I mean, that critically explained how our ruling class actually operates in the present day, and not just Sam Francis's complaints about it in the 1990s.
Okay. So to your point, to you guys' point about why Moldbug was popular, I think Moldbug was popular for, I broadly agree with you, but let me restate it. One is he was in the budding tech industry, but he also has some financial savvy. So he used language that was familiar to both people in the financial sector and people in the tech sector. And so it was more like the mode of communication was the actual compelling thing. And furthermore, he makes a lot of references to pop culture and sci-fi. So it's also appealing to nerds. And so you know who your culture base is. You appeal to what your culture base wants, and you talk to your culture base the way they want to be talked to. I think that really sums up Moldbug's rapid popularity so soon. And of course, he was well positioned at the beginning of 2007, or at the middle and end of 2007, to launch his project. So for me, just as a brief introduction to why I'm interested in Moldbug, Moldbug is clearly downstream of Hans Hermann Hoppe. A lot of his ideas are very
agreed.
Very clearly Hans Hermann Hoppe's.
Yeah.
And there was a time when I would have openly endorsed such positions, probably around the same time that Unqualified Reservations was being written, at least up until around 2010 or 11. And then I started to change. I'm like, well, okay, there's these historical arguments that are made, or predictions that are made based on the libertarian axioms. And like, I just don't see these. Like, I don't see them happening in the contexts in which they were supposed to have happened. The reading of given events didn't jibe with me. And so by the time I get to 2015, I would no longer identify as a libertarian. Around that time, I debated Walter Block and Stefan Kinsella, 2015, 2016 on the NAP. And then after that, I started hearing about the alt-right. I heard about them like in 2012, thanks to Richard Spencer and the new podcast at the time. And a lot of these were people that were sort of now at a position that I had since left. And it became increasingly frustrating trying to get through to them with a new set of ideas and a new set of values that I was trying to communicate when they were just caught up in the mystique that was Moldbug. And so it just wasn't the time to really engage.
Well, I actually, hold on, Todd. I don't really remember. I mean, I lived through that period too. I felt like very few of those alt-right guys in 2016 and 17 were quoting Moldbug. I was the person quoting Moldbug, and they were talking about other things. The common ancestor is obviously Sam Francis between the two of them. Well, so we could skip the Moldbug and say like it all came from Francis, right?
Oh, we could, but let me rephrase this and see if you'll agree with this, Dave.
Sure.
In the same way that in the American South, there's this term, the Christ-haunted South, even though it's de-religiousized, there's this ghost of Christ that haunts it. The impression that I got was there was a Moldbug haunted right, in the sense that there was a whole body of concepts that even if people didn't know where they came from Moldbug.
Well, the one I remember, maybe the only one I can remember that fits that description was the cathedral. which is a term I still like in the Moldbugian sense.
I think a lot of the monarchist jargon also comes from that. You get that from him.
Maybe. I mean, I don't remember that being so prominent, but I remember there being jokes about it, I guess. Like monarchist cat or something like that. But I don't remember that ever being a serious thing that the alt-right kind of carried across it. Other than just being kind of like edgy, I guess.
No, I mean, broadly, there were three groups, and I don't necessarily want to get into all this now. There was the Manosphere, the Ethno-Nationalists, and the NRX. And I think early on, NRX had a lot of the steam and then lost it. But I won't get into all that. That's not really the point of this discussion. But it was right after You Could Only Lose the Culture War broke that I decided that this was a time to launch this Moldbug matrix.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got it, Todd, because I think, I don't want to interrupt you here, but I'm just going to kind of lay this out right now. I mean, Moldbug had some bomb essays at the end of 2022 that, these were criticisms that all of his readers were making throughout his UR career. But then he kind of condensed them into a few essays where it was like everything in this essay is just wrong. And so that made it very, very easy to consolidate, like, okay, this is just where he goes wrong, right?
Sure, but that's the point. Like, enough people who were either sympathetic to Moldbug or formerly Moldbug supporters were rethinking their commitments and loyalties. And so that's sort of just the brief backstory to how I got to the Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. And so yeah, I guess the first thing to start about is his first essay on formalism, which is sort of downstream where all of his political thought comes from.
Yeah.
Now, so there's a couple ways you can look at his issue on formalism. The first thing is I think that what I've been sort of trying to come to is if you read at an exoteric level a lot of Moldbug's writings and then compare what he said in one paragraph to another paragraph in the same document, he contradicts himself repeatedly. So unless you just want
but we can steelman these things into, like, I could steelman formalism.
Yeah, but hold on. So then the other thing is, okay, well,
we can like, not just go through like 20-year-old articles and find seeming contradictions in language. That's not going to be very fruitful, I don't think. Right?
No, but here's the point. Let me finish. So the point is this.
Yeah, you give us your perspective on formalism, and then we can steelman it after.
So the first thing is the only way that it made sense to me, given what Moldbug has stated in his articles, is that he's a Stirnerite. So Max Stirner and The Unique and Its Property writes, the dispute over property rights staggers in vehement agitation. The communist state, the earth rightfully belongs to those who till it, and the products are the same to those who produce them. I think it belongs to the one who knows how to take it, or who doesn't let it be taken from him, doesn't let himself be deprived of it. If he appropriates it, then not only the earth, but also the right to it belongs to him. This is egotistic right. So Moldbug in Formalism states these two paragraphs. A good formalist will have none of this. But because to a formalist, the fact that the U.S. can determine what happens on the North American continent between the 49th parallel and the Rio Grande, AK and HI, etc., means that it is entirely which owns the country. It is the entity which owns the country. And the fact that the U.S. extracts regular payments from the aforementioned fur-bearing critters means no more than it owns that right. The various maneuvers and pseudo-legalities by which it acquired these properties are all just history. What matters is that it has them now and it doesn't want to give them over any more than you want to give me your wallet. And then from the same essay, whether we're talking about the U.S., Baltimore, or your wallet, a formalist is only happy when ownership and control are one and the same. To reformalize, therefore, we need to figure out who has actual power in the U.S. and who assigns the shares in such a way as to reproduce this distribution as closely as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, throughout the essay, he says, well, I don't care about who ought to own things. I only care about who does. Now, if that's not eerily similar to Max Stirner, I don't know what is. And I think that's the secret understanding of...
Well, okay, but this... Okay, I'm sorry. Are you done, Todd? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, this kind of hinges on the thing I really like about Moldbug with the thing I really don't like. Moldbug tries to isolate these things into sort of a nihilistic culture or, value-free perspective, which I think is impossible. But what formalism points to is a very real political problem where governments will try to wield power and then claim that they don't actually hold that power so that they are not accountable for the results. You see this very much on this display in the Ukrainian war. I don't want to threaten your channel, Charlemagne, but it's very obvious that the State Department is waging a war against Russia, and Russia is waging a war another direction. But we have to put up with this pretense that there's this guy called Zelensky who's like this, this leader of this independent Ukraine movement, and this creates all sorts of. The conversation can't be clear about our objectives. We have to operate through this phony baloney pretense that the parties who are actually responsible for this war aren't the ones that are actually fighting it. And that's the real political problem at the heart of that Moldbug's getting at in formalism. Despite his sort of cringe attempt to make it amoral, which is, that's the mistake you see very much on display, and you can only lose the culture war.
I think so. There are multiple ways to look at formalism, and this is kind of a criticism you could levy at Moldbug in general. Is it's almost impossible to really figure out what he believes. One way to look at his formalism essay is it's sort of a thought experiment to show you what would happen if the people who were making decisions were actually responsible for those decisions, and how people would react if that were the case, right? So for all the bad decisions that have made in politics over the last 15 or so years since he wrote these essays, the people who make those bad decisions aren't actually responsible for them. So in some way, he's asking you to just imagine an alternative society that where the government is legitimately responsible for what it does, and he's doing this amorally because he's attempting to address liberals, really, and therefore he can't really take a right-wing perspective and try to convince them that way. So he sort of has to smuggle in this sort of monarchism, as he calls it, without immediately putting off all of his readers. So I think that's one way you could look at it is okay, well, Moldbug doesn't actually believe in formalism, because even at the time, if you think if everything was formalized, that sounds great from a personal perspective, right? Okay, I just own everything I control, and I don't have to pay any taxes or all this unless I want to. But then we have the flip side where the neocons now basically own everything at a power level. So that's a serious issue, right? But
and the example I'm sure Moldbug's thinking of is like San Francisco. I mean, the Democratic Party in San Francisco, yeah, it has 100% power in that city. And yet somehow the homeless problem that's consuming it whole is the fault of Texas or something like that, right? and people buy it, right? Because the press tells them that.
All right. So, okay, looking at formalism, then the way he applies it is extremely slipshod. So in his second essay, The Case Against Democracy and 10 Red Pills, he goes through all these bromides and tries to flip them on their head. But throughout his essays, you'll find FDR considered a democracy and then a dictator. You'll consider democracy is the United States, but democracy is also the mid-20th century Germans and the Soviet Union. And it's no. All of those three things cannot be held under the same label.
Okay, I like your Schrodinger's democracy concept that you've noticed a lot. So yeah, please elaborate more specifically on the problem with what Moldbug's democracy actually is.
Right. Well, because there's a concept, and I don't remember the name of it, but I remember hearing it in a lecture given by, I don't know, what was it? Roderick T. Long, about definitions. And this was in my libertarian days. And he said that if you have a word that claims two subjects that are mutually contradictory to each other, then that word is a bad word. It needs to be either split or redefined.
Agreed.
Yeah. Well, you can't very well include FDR and Stalin under the same label. Stalin was a totalitarian dictatorship, and FDR was a democratically elected official, whether you like his policies or not. So they both can't be democracies. This is where he's indebted to Kuhn and Ledeen, comes up with the idea of demotism, as if totalitarian regimes are democratic. In fact, totalitarian regimes are formalist. We know exactly who's in charge in the Soviet Union. It's Stalin. And we know exactly if Stalin catches a cold, everybody in Russia gets sick. I would think Moldbug will be happy with that level of formalism.
I think, though, that just again to Steelman, Todd, that Moldbug is not incorrect by taking a broader view and looking at the governments of the 1930s and realizing that relative to previous governments, including previous monarchical governments, they have a lot of things that are different about them than past governments of Europe, and a lot of things that are similar about themselves to each other. The idea that these were all governments organized around a single party, that cared deeply about influencing public opinion and whose power extended from the pretense that they were speaking for the people. That was a common element of FDR's regime, of Hitler's regime, of Stalin's regime, and it markedly separates them from most previous governments in Europe.
Right,
Moldbug
okay.
is not wrong to notice that difference, and I don't think he's wrong to suspect that difference as being the source of a lot of problems in Europe.
Okay, so now we're going to expand this because this is where the problem arises. Democracy, classically understood, is a decision-making process. We saw this with ancient Athens. We saw this with the Icelandic Althing, which is a parliament that's still in session in Iceland today. We saw this in Puritan New England and the Germanic and Celtic tribes of the ancient and early medieval world. Now, that was a decision-making process. The term, quote, demotism is different. It's about popular sovereignty, which begins in the Enlightenment with the French Revolution. But a totalitarian regime and a democratic regime can both make appeals to popular sovereignty, but that has nothing to do with the decision-making process.
No, I agree with you. Moldbug's being sloppy with his language. But what I'm telling you is if we steelman it, what Moldbug is concerned about are these oligarchic bodies that are organized around appeals to popular sovereignty and that control through control of the media in a way such that oligarchic decisions or monarchical decisions are presented as erupting spontaneously out of a popular will that is, basically an extension of the oligarchy itself, hence kind of shrouding where the decision actually comes from.
Okay,
in some ways, the defense is kind of lame because I think it's clear that Moldbug intends you not to take his formalism concept or the way he talks about democracy as a sort of generalized principle to apply to, other parts of history. And he's really trying to get you to re-examine your assumptions about how power works now. And that's really what all of his essays are about, is how do things actually work now? And his references to the past are usually in the aid of that end and not trying to get you to apply his models to the past necessarily.
Well, I mean, he's getting this from Hoppe, and that's what Hoppe does. And reading, at least as of 2007, I'm still in his 2007 articles. That's what it appears to me. You can't call FDR fascist, then democratic, then something else. He's got to be something. And
what would you term, given, I think you agreed with the idea that there was this common feature that these 1930s 1940s regimes had with each other that was different than previous regimes in Europe. What would you name that?
There's two differences, right? One is downstream from the French Revolution, sovereignty was no longer embodied in God or the gods, right? Athens is a democracy,
yes,
but the gods are sovereign.
So all three are radically secular. I agree with that.
Yeah. And Puritan New England, right? The idea was God was sovereign. It wasn't radically secular. So yes, popular sovereignty and democracy are two different things, and they ought not to be confused, which is what I see Moldbug doing. But then secondarily, and I think this is actually more important, is that all three of these regimes were, okay, you'll like this, Dave. So in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, he talks about how the democratic, fascist, and communist regimes are all techno-futurist regimes that will in the long run abolish man, only at different speed rates.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That is the fundamental. But you see, Moldbug represents the vanguard of this. He represents the vanguard of digital society, so he's not going to say that. But that, I think, is the fundamental common factor.
Well, I mean, what you see in the early 20th century is sort of the first tendrils of the technological revolution come online, and you have governments. For the first time in a long time, governments are really capable of a certain level of thought control that they were never capable of before. And this, in combination with this appeal to, popular sovereignty or whatever, this creates the problem that I feel Curtis Yarvin's very right to be concerned about.
But the thing, he's not, because he's advocating for the forefront of this technological revolution, which is the root cause of the similarities.
One of the interesting things I think you brought up on this subject on the 17th stream you did, which I think was today actually, or it might have been yesterday, in your own series, is you quoted one of his posts where he sort of he basically says that the internet and technology is sort of a threat to the regime in a way because It's fundamentally like uncontrollable and just totally open, and that's a pretty big L on Moldbug's part, right? So I think, not to like rag on that, because obviously it's hard to make predictions, but to say that I think a lot of his thought in 07, 08 is based on this idea that the internet is and technology it actually cannot be totally controlled by the regime from an information propagation perspective, but we've really come to see that it's actually quite the opposite. So anything he writes based on that assumption is then seriously up for question.
Yeah,
I agree. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say. So the thing that you mentioned, Moldbug, or sorry, Charlemagne. Where I just had this, I wrote it down. Where he talks about just this issue of Oh, go ahead, Dave. I'll look it up. I haven't found it yet.
Okay, so I mean, I agree, Charlemagne, that he is way too techno-optimistic in the early post-Sun UR, and that definitely we have to reevaluate that. And I'll admit, I have not gone back and revisited UR for years and years and years. I've kind of, moved a little bit beyond that. I've almost kind of forgotten half the things he said there. So I'm sure Todd's much more knowledgeable about that old stuff than I am. But I'm going to kind of try to extract a concession here, Charlemagne. In a way, governments have shown that they're very capable of controlling information, but something has made the consensus that embodied the Western world order much more brittle and much less believable in the last 20 years. In the 1990s, it was impossible to see these systems of control, but they were no less real in the 90s than they are now. But now everyone can see them. I can't, and obviously you could you're within your rights to just reply back to me that this is due to the corruption and age of the regime itself. But I can't discount also the role that internet technology has played in exposing the media for being just a pack of liars in many circumstances, in many occasions.
Yes. Well, there's a couple ways I want to go with that. So I'll start with the quote I was looking for. His mediocrity article, Definition, Ideology, and Treatment. One of the main problems with mediocrity is that it depends on centralized control of public information, a control which is rapidly evaporating with the phenomena such as homeschooling, bloggers, and YouTube. I mean, look at, so this belies an entire misunderstanding of the internet completely. Because first of all, the internet was produced by DARPA, and DARPA was working on a project called LifeLog, which was supposed to be a way to digitally track all Americans through some sort of online dossiers. That was extremely unpopular as a government initiative. The same day LifeLog closes, Facebook opens its doors. Now we learn that Facebook has backdoor switches that the government can access, and it can track all of us. So what DARPA was trying to do was, in the 60s and 70s, hunting down radicals was really hard. But if you could get everybody in cyberspace, at least to some degree, then you could track everybody and no one's hidden. And so this idea that Moldbug has, which is rather naive, and a lot of people at the time had, that the rising computer age was the result of just this spontaneous order of laissez-faire capitalism and not DARPA labs in California. They just totally misread the situation.
Hold on. I really don't think that Moldbug was commenting on the origin. Moldbug knows as well as I do that it came from DARPA. And would have been under no illusions about that. I think that he was really looking forward.
Then it's not for free speech.
Well, I would say on
that's just a logical jump. I mean, you can't assume that because something originates in DARPA, it necessarily won't. I mean, you're right. Moldbug was wrong.
That's Moldbug's assumption. If it arises from the state, it's for control.
Hold on, Todd. I think Moldbug definitely has a significant blind spot in terms of not realizing that his own profession basically is not quite as organic as one would be led to believe. I don't think he's unaware of those sort of origins, but I think he's a bit too optimistic in terms of how spontaneous the technological or information revolution really was. I do broadly agree with Dave's point earlier that there's certainly been an enormous opportunity cost for the regime in exercising its control over information. So have they managed to control the internet far more than any of these tech bros 20 years ago could have believed? Yes, but there was an enormous opportunity cost in the regime's legitimacy in doing so. So although Yarvin was incorrect about whether or not the regime would be capable of doing that. I don't think it has the impact that it would have had the um, regime been incapable of it.
I have there was a point you ended with, Dave, before I jumped in, and I wanted to
Mhm.
respond to it. What was the last thing that you said before I started talking just now?
Uh, oh, was it about just the DARPA? Just because something begins in DARPA doesn't mean it's
No,
not
it was
good.
before that.
Oh, well, I was talking about the legitimacy. I mean, to what extent is if you compare now to the 90s, it strikes me pretty like when Sam Francis was writing to take the sort of immediate like original source of some of these ideas, right? The regime was much more secure in the 90s than it is now. I think we agree on that, right?
It's more
Yeah,
secure or less secure?
I think
But
it's simultaneously
it's
both.
less it has more power, like explicitly, but it's way less secure in its legitimacy.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I see so many people that still buy the narrative. I mean, especially with the whole war in Eastern Europe, it's like I've seen like hardcore leftists that have opposed American intervention since Vietnam flip on a dime to starting World War III with Putin, and I'm just like, whoa, I didn't see that coming.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think that has a cost. I mean, they're flipping because they don't actually believe.
Well, no, yes. But what I'm saying is, if the regime could capture all these anti-war advocates and then shunt them into a war, that's a huge flex of its ability to consolidate enemies into itself.
Sure, but I think the number of people and the percentage of population who simply can no longer be brought under the regime's umbrella through any narrative, I think that has actually increased. I mean, I know that people who have been in the quote unquote scene or whatever for decades have said as much as well, that there's far more legitimate opposition to the regime in a complete way than there ever was like 20 or 30 years ago. So I do
No,
think
I agree that there are more people now that are awake to what the system is doing. Sure. In the 90s, those of us that were onto what the machine was doing were pretty alone. But and yeah, the internet was a double-edged sword, and that's how all that information came out. But they've tied it up, and the real question is, the Great Purge of 2017, was it too late? We don't know, but they demonstrated they have control now.
I think part of the problem in answering this question is really that it's sort of a wait and see, because we're still in the middle of the power consolidation process, and I think it's pretty obvious that a certain sequence of events, I don't know what it could be, but you could imagine sequences of events that would just totally destroy the regime as it is and topple it like it's balanced on the head of a pin or something. But at the same time, it also seems impossible how they would ever lose grip of their power. So I don't think we can really say much definitive on the answer to this question, because it's still very much up in the air over the next several years, like how successful they can be at actually consolidating power.
Sure. Well, one thing that I wanted to bring up and ask you as a question, Dave, is in his formalism essay, Moldbug says that he's sort of giving people a DIY kit for ideology. So the way you can read this,
That sounds really cringe now.
it does sound cringe. So
Yeah. I mean, some things just don't, like some prose styles just don't last 10 years on the internet,
no, but I'm here to make it a point with a
Sure.
point
Okay.
with
My bad. Go ahead. Yeah.
is so when it comes to what Moldbug, okay, so there's what Moldbug is saying himself, okay, and then there's what a lot of people have said Moldbug said. Now, on the one hand, I think that demonstrates the success of what Moldbug wanted to do. He wanted other people to build their own ideologies, but I think that a lot of people have, in fulfilling that operation, have mistaken what they think as what Moldbug thought. Those are not necessarily the same.
Sure. I guess it's a little difficult. You're a little bit more fresh on these essays. I don't remember reading anything in Moldbug that was radically departed from what I remember reading in 2012. I guess maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, no. The point that I'm getting at is with regards to Moldbug's contradictions within his own thought. There's nothing that I'm reading yet where he later reveals, "Oh, guys, I tied it all together. It's one big joke. Sorry." That could be. I mean, there's like 10 years of stuff to read, but I haven't got there yet. And so I'm operating on the assumption that either this is completely contradictory at a face level, or if there is a deeper consistency, what might it be?
Well, I mean, with the formalism stuff, though, I mean, I don't know if he's talked about this recently. I mean, well, he talked about this more in like the early Gray Mirror stuff, but this whole concept of dark power, this whole idea that power is wielded without a direct understanding of who's accountable for it. This is what I see as being the product that emerged from the formalism stuff. Now, maybe I'm misremembering the chain of events that actually led through UR, but that's the nugget that came out of all of this kind of formalism stuff after you take away the stuff that's kind of bullshit and doesn't last or doesn't hold up. So, I mean, like, I think that's what, when people say, Moldbug taught me this about formalism, they're really talking about this. It's a pattern that a lot of people have pointed out, but again, I think Moldbug put it in sort of a Silicon Valley style language, which was really important because that's really the side of where a lot of the newest iterations of this stuff occurred. What we're seeing is a pattern that this regime has or likes, where it wields power and then it pretends like someone else wielded it or the people did it or something, right? You'll have this when people describe the whole COVID regime. This will be presented as emerging from some kind of desire of the people themselves. Like, we all decided to lock down and we all decided to take vaccines, and that's how it's presented. And when you see that, you're really seeing as the movement of dark power. What happened was that a certain government bureaucracy made these decisions, maybe certain people, but we don't really have a good understanding of who that is or what the process was that made it.
Okay, there's a question here.
Yeah, I just popped it on stream. I think it's a little related to kind of what you just said about how power operates. So Kyle Warner's just asking if we still believe in the cathedral, which is kind of a weird way to put it. I mean, I would say that well, for one, we've managed to go 30 minutes without saying the word cathedral, which is pretty good for a Moldbug stream. But here we are addressing it now. So, I mean, the cathedral is just sort of this concept that there's this organic consensus that works its way through all of the cultural institutions, and power sort of organically coordinates through this like semi-spontaneous agreement. There are certain nodes of power that sort of determine like what you're supposed to think, which are the universities, and the media propagates those ideas.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is still a good concept. I would say power is a lot more top down than what the cathedral concept on its own allows you to realize. I mean, sure, the professors are coming up with these concepts, but at the end of the day, we understand that there is power. It's acting. There are organized groups of elites. As Dave said, it's hard to really know who exactly they are. We know about institutes. We know about, the Tony Blair Institute, for example, is obviously a really good one. The Ford Foundation, right? There is power that's actually coordinating in a top-down way above the cathedral. I think the cathedral is less a full explanation of how the oligarchy works and just more or less one component of how the ideology is basically distributed to the masses, which actually matters. But that's my perspective.
Yeah, but this is an important distinction, Charlemagne, because when I think that, and this is the problem, I'm so far away from these authors that I'm going to butcher them in my memory. But I think that Sam Francis, in his writings, if I remember them correctly, he kind of put a little bit more of a fine point on sort of the government bureaucracies that were making these decisions. But if you were to take Francis's ideas and present them to people in UC Berkeley, I mean, they'll reject them because they will have had the same ideas, but their ideas were not delivered to them by some org chart that began at the State Department and went through the Trilateral Commission or something like that, or the Ford Foundation. From their perspective, they came up with these ideas organically, and they're sort of unaware of this organic process of power that's standing behind them. And for the longest time, the movements of actual explicit power were kind of hidden behind this model of oligarchic consensus that was way too top down to accurately represent the consensus building process that would be going on in some place like UC Berkeley or Silicon Valley or Hollywood. And these are all places where I've talked to like literal people like who are making movies and teaching classes and stuff like that. And they are incredibly locked into a consensus, and they just don't know it. They're unaware of it.
So when it comes to the cathedral, I guess you can look at it in two ways. If all Moldbug is saying is that elites, whether they're public or private or NGO, kind of all come from the same clubs and all kind of, and he has hinted at that elsewhere, are all sort of in it together, and there's not a whole lot of distinction between them. That, and now this is what he says, is that there's this, they are adapting to these new situations and then imposing these, or pioneering these new social changes as adaptive situations to the environment that they're in. Now, one, I would agree that there is this incestuous cabal. So, for example, you have Robert McNamara, who was in the U.S. Army, then he was head of Ford, then he was in the Johnson administration, then he was a head of the World Bank. So, clearly these guys are all in a revolving door. One, the left has been saying that for the last 60 years. It's not really a new idea. I mean, Chomsky's been saying that since the 70s. Second of all, the idea that this is a spontaneous just completely does not carry water. So first of all, and this
I need to, the spontaneous word there is doing a lot of work. I think that's going to be a contention, so you're aware of it. But please proceed.
So the point is, let's look at a lot of the cultural changes that have occurred in this country that we all object to. Well, a huge impetus for the sexual revolution was Alfred Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute, which was funded by the Rockefellers. And then because he represented science, he could then go around the country and say all these laws about, things I don't want to talk about right now are, fuddy-duddy and obsolete. We need just to loosen up and embrace our sexuality. That, along with other people like Wilhelm Reich, were all sort of working on this together to primarily coming at it from the private angle, not the public. Now, we do have the deep state behind second wave feminism with Gloria Steinem being a CIA asset. So again, I'm not saying the deep state doesn't do any of this or the state proper, but the thing that Moldbug doesn't like about politics in the state sphere is that it's not formalist. We don't know who does what. We don't know who's responsible, but he's actually creating a smoke machine for his own side. If we applied formalism to his tech side, we would see that so many things that are happening in this country are not only not organic, not spontaneous, but the result of premeditated technical projects that he wants to obscure. So
okay, well, I mean, like let's put a finer point on this, because you're talking about a world that I know pretty well, right? I mean, how did the story of how Judith Butler's ideas go from UC Berkeley in the 80s to being everywhere in Silicon Valley and Hollywood in 2023? I don't know. Spontaneous is a hard word. I don't exactly know what you mean by it. I would not use the word spontaneous to describe that process.
Well, he calls it.
I would certainly not describe it as organized.
Let me double back on the cathedral again, because I feel like there's a better way to talk about it. So, this whole concept that we're discussing really comes down to, okay, it seems like all of the elites and institutions, they all just agree on everything. So naturally, you, the discerning person, are going to look for like the source coordinating all this agreement. Why did just the New York Times agree with Harvard, as he says, and yada, yada, yada. Okay, so the answer is basically because they all believe in the same religion, or a religion, as he calls it, or you could just say metaphysics or progressivism, right? They all just believe in the same thing because they all read the same papers and go to the same schools and exist in the same milieu. And it's really not actually a commentary on how power coordinates. It's just sort of about like, okay, the coordination is happening not because there's a top-down controller over everybody, but just because all these people and all these foundations and institutions grew up and were educated in the same idea system. So that's kind of the point of the cathedral, is it's not really about power itself. It's more about where does the belief come from, and how does everyone believe the same thing without necessarily direct coordination. And I think that's a flaw in how he presents power in his blogs, because he very rarely actually addresses power directly, especially once he comes up with the cathedral concept, and more just talks about like the underlying belief network, I guess, if you will.
No, I mean, to go back to our example, I mean, what is that? What does that tell you about how like Judith Butler's ideas went from Berkeley to Silicon Valley and Hollywood in 20 years? I mean, to me, the religious model is a better explanation than like there was a foundation that was organizing this transfer. Right?
Well, yeah. Let me explain. So this is something that I haven't brought up in the Moldbug show directly because this is not really related. But let me give you my model for how we can say these private corporate entities were responsible for this. So once you have the slope of liberalizing sexual norms to allowing for divorce to where we're at now with transgenderism, we have all of a sudden now, sexual diseases that didn't exist before. Also identities that didn't exist before that are reaffirmed by consumption. So this is a part of a broader project to create captive markets, to create identities that are themselves consumer identities. And so I guess I'll use Moldbug's word here then. It was an organic process of creating all these captive markets based on sexual preferences so that they would be consuming pharmaceuticals for their health and content for their persona so that they would have an identity completely reduced to a corporate IP.
I don't see how that answered the specific.
So yeah, the way it answers it is that the corporations have a vested interest in tearing down these norms because they're not the older norms that America had prior to 1945 were not profitable. They wanted to maximize profits and create captive markets.
But if I were to go to somebody who actually ran one of these corporations, like, I'm not going to pretend like I'm like. But I have talked to people who've run Silicon Valley companies like once or twice. Like, I really doubt that, like, they wouldn't be lying to me if they said that they had no knowledge of what you were talking about.
No, I know they wouldn't be lying, and Moldbug has said as much too. But I mean, in a large organization, hold on, in a large organization, especially a corporate organization, only a handful of people make the decisions, and anybody that is lower down just has to follow the orders. They don't.
But I'm talking about the CEOs, like. I'm literally talking to I've talked to the CEOs once or twice, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they wouldn't be lying if they told me that they weren't doing this, right? Consciously, at least, right?
Well, yeah, consciously, but there's still this drive to create commodities where none existed, and this is just an expression of that.
Well, the fact that it's subconscious.
Well, I'm not saying
it kind of lends it more to. I really do want to appreciate, like, what you're saying is correct, but like the fact that it's subconscious does sort of lean more towards the Moldbugian perspective, whether it's original or not.
Okay, right? Hold on. Some people did know, right? I mean, have you read E. Michael Jones' Libido Dominandi? He goes into detail about how the Rockefellers intentionally created this monster. Like, at some point, somebody knew.
Well, which Rockefeller? Well, I mean, we'd have to get into the. I think I've read that book. I forget. Sorry, it's been a while. But. Okay, but if there were one or two, like, sort of Dr. Evil CEOs, I don't know. Is that the explanation about, again, I don't want to kind of sound like a broken record. Is that the explanation about how Judith Butler's ideas went from Berkeley to Silicon Valley and Hollywood in 15 years?
No, that's not the sole answer. So let's restate this, and then if you want, I'll go into another.
Sure.
Another analysis.
I don't want to minimize what you're saying because, like, there's truth there, right? But
so what I'd want to say is that there is, on the one hand, basic market pressures, and those pressures are to break down these sort of conservative sexual ties in order to commodify sex. Also, there are people for their own interests that have a personal interest in doing so, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. That's one mechanism that is being an input into this, coming from big finance. The other thing that I'd say that's also responsible for this is the sort of like rise of technology as a whole, right? Because the goal of the Silicon Valley elite is to have some sort of transhumanist future where we transcend our human bodies entirely. Now, whether any of us believe that can happen is a whole nother question, but that's what a lot of them believe. I mean, Ray Kurzweil is a perfect example of this. And so they're going to have a narrative that is going to be corrosive to traditional values, whether that's something that they intentionally want to do or not, whether it's a Dr. Evil rubbing his hands or whether it's somebody believing that technology can upload you into a computer and live forever. And it's this rise of a technological society that imposes all sorts of constraints and limits on human behavior, especially more traditional forms of human behavior, that have also eroded this and allowed for, because actually there was one of Nick Land's early articles where he talks about the rise of the commercial society, the oceanic commercial sphere. He has that line about that Chinese transgender assassin, and he basically just is, I think it was from 1996. He's basically just saying that this is the perfect techno-human because there's nothing organic or real about this person. And I think that's also a driving factor pushing us further away from anything that any of us in this room would want.
I agree with everything you said. That still sounds a lot more to me like the whole religious model, though. Maybe I'm missing, but I don't know. Charlemagne, do you have any? It sounds like the religious model again, I guess. Maybe with some, a few very rare Dr. Evils mixed in.
I think it's clear that there's some Dr. Evils, and part of the problem is, well, from their own perspective, they're not evil. They're doing, great good by advancing humanity into the future. And these are, the heads of major foundations, maybe even the SPLC, the Rockefeller Institute or Foundation, Ford Foundation, right? So there's not even just one Dr. Evil. It's still oligarchy all the way at the top, but they're going to self-conceptualize as, doing the right thing. Part of the problem is to actually untie the actual power behind the religious propagation of these ideas takes a ridiculous amount of deep research. So I can't really comment too much on the specifics of Dr. Evil because it's opaque on purpose. But I think we should move on from this topic. But I think we all have the sense to some extent that people are pulling strings in ways that we cannot actually see, but we can feel the strings being pulled. And this actually happens very rarely. I think the general case, this sort of gets into the Schmittian idea of the exception, right? I think the cathedral is sort of the general case, how things proceed when everything is just fine and hunky-dory for power. But every now and then, power does pull the strings in a major and coordinated way that is noticeable because of how punctuated it is, like with the recent injections, I guess we could say. But for the most of the time, it's not like that. So I think we should. I don't even think you've gotten to the cathedral in your video series yet, Todd. So I think we should
I have not.
Let's put a cap on that topic for now. I think it was interesting and relevant to cover, but I'd like to get more into some of your specifics.
Right. So I guess I don't know. You can tell me more about, or Charlemagne, if this is going back to where we just left. But I feel like that by beating this formalist drum, Moldbug is deflecting from his own profession, which is as much.
How much does he actually beat on the formalist drum?
All the time. He's all the time talking about, the New York Times, the press, the government, all of which are powerful. I'm not saying they're not, but he never once mentions what his side is doing.
We mean, can I clarify, Todd? Do you mean computer programmers?
Well, the entire Silicon Valley culture that he was on the ground floor of.
Mm-hmm.
Because again,
okay, I mean, so
if we want to say that a good case can be made that transgenderism is just a precursor to transhumanism. So a lot of this is the result of Silicon Valley. If we had somehow not had this happen, the conditions would not have been ripe for this new movement to develop. It's difficult to envision without this sort of techno-utopianism of the 90s, the aughts, and the early 2010s, anything like transgenderism occurring in the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s.
It would definitely be difficult to imagine the transgender phenomena happening in such a large percentage of the population as it does without this sort of virtualized space that you can actually live in.
Yes.
But if we didn't
that's the technology definitely suggests that, right?
And so the point that I'm getting at is, yes, there's always going to be problems in the world. And there are, and there will be with or without computers. But the megaphone amplifier of all of the problems that he's been criticizing since 2007 is the internet. Is this digital in technical world that is being created. That's the amplifier for all this. And then that's where you get into accelerationism with Nick Land. I don't know a whole lot about Nick, but he was another big NRX guy. I think Nick's view of technology, at least in that regard, is a little more plausible. And he was writing that in 1996. And then, so that's the real ratchet here. It's digital, the digital world.
Moldbug's view on his own people, the Silicon Valley tribe, which he was definitely much a part of. His view on them is basically that their style of governing, if you will, should be the one adopted by whoever's governing the United States, because the tech people, they can fail hard and iterate quickly and just do things more efficiently than the managers will, and that efficiency will result in just better material conditions for everybody.
I consider this one of Moldbug's major mistakes. I mean, I think
look at California today.
Well, okay, no, I'm gonna steal, man. Like, okay, like I think Moldbug is dead wrong, right? But speaking as a Californian, the leaders of California and the sort of Silicon Valley technocratic class are two different sets of people, and nobody living in that state would ever confuse them. And if you were a Californian and your entire world was California, it would be a forgivable mistake to want to put the technocrats in power over the sort of soulless, mindless Nancy Pelosi types.
I mean, but you don't think that the Silicon Valley types have a controlling stake in how the states run?
I think they're much more followers.
Well,
to be honest,
ultimately,
I can think of numerous things where Silicon Valley has tried to get concessions from the California government and failed.
Sure, but if we view them as a lobby group versus all the other lobby groups in California, they have a lot more voice than, say, white farmers from Orange County.
Well, yeah, I mean, they have more than zero. Yeah, I guess you're right. Okay, I mean, yeah, it's all comparative, right?
But
so you're right. Like they're not the least powerful, but what I'm saying is that they're distinct, right? And so to Steelman Moldbug, I look, you're right that he's wrong, but this is, I would be kind of remiss if I didn't kind of Steelman it and kind of say, like, Nancy Pelosi is not Silicon Valley culture.
No, she's not. But
yeah,
the other point is, so
one of the interesting things about tech power is it definitely exists, but unfortunately for Moldbug's people, and I suppose mine, it doesn't actually come from the programmers. There's a lot of power in tech, and it comes from the Trust and Safety Council and whatever.
Yeah.
Who, as we can see what happened with Twitter, right? These people were removed, but it's clear there's some sort of power struggle going on there. These people have power through the technology. So
they have power because they're essentially the midway point between the two groups of people that I was pointing to. Because they have one foot in each world, they can effectively be the mediator and the decider between the two of them. And so their way goes. And they tend to go more with the Nancy Pelosi types. They tend to keep the tech bros in their little corner playing their video games and imagining Ray Kurzweil realities that never come to fruition.
Well, the point that I want to make is if we look at the last 20 years of the competing interests in this country, I guess the military-industrial complex comes in at number 1, but in the top 5 is tech. Because tech always, no matter what social concerns are being pointed to, nobody ever says at the national or state level, well, gee, maybe this outroll of tech is not good for social cohesion. Nobody ever does that. They always roll it out. So it's certainly the top 5 influencers of both federal and state policy.
Well, hold on, Todd. I mean, they do. I mean, that's how you get chatbot GPT saying that it would rather nuke New York City than say the N-word.
Right.
There are people who control the tech flow out, but it just gets controlled by the people you don't like. And I don't like either, right? They're both of our enemies, right? But you can see exactly how this process. What I'm telling you, though, Todd, the ideologues are the senior party, and the tech guys are the junior one.
Well, I mean, if we look at, say, back to, I forget the euphemism you used, Charlemagne, for let's call it 2020. White Lab Code said, do it to the whole world, and they did. I mean, that's power. Bill Gates said, do it to the whole world.
But he's not a tech pro, though, right? That's
No, he's
like,
finance. He founded Microsoft. I mean, there's still these tech oligarchs, like not George Soros. I just mentioned.
Sure. I mean, he achieved oligarchical power through a technology company, but he himself is not actually a technical guy. I mean, at the end of the day, the programmers like Moldbug were extraordinarily naive. Like, they basically believed that they were running the show and making the decisions when really, I mean, again, you can just look at how these companies were funded, right? Ultimately, it was finance allowing this technical boom to even happen. And they were the ones making the real decisions and still are. So Moldbug certainly has a understandable amount of naivete when it comes to the influence of his own class.
Or like even Steve Jobs or Wozniak. I mean, these are the guys that have tremendous power, and they were on the ground floor of Silicon Valley in the 60s.
Okay, I mean, so kind of to sort of try to isolate your point, Todd, are you saying that you think that there is a gradual coup and that the technocrats are starting to become more powerful than the sort of progressive politicrat class in California?
Well, I would argue that progressivism in the United States, when it began in the 1890s, was already seeking to embrace this technocracy, because the buzzword was scientific management. And so, well, yes, it was Republican and Democratic progressives passing the laws. Okay, let me put it this way, Dave. In the Middle Ages, right, it might have been the king that passed the laws, but it was the priest who was talking to the Pope who told the king what to do, ideally. And so to say, well, the king enforces the laws doesn't really mean the king has the real power until he does, like with Becket. But the assumption was that the real power goes to the man behind the curtain, the priest, and then up to the Pope. And I'm saying that these techno oligarchs are like that. You know, the white lab coats can say, you know, give everybody Pfizer and the whole world gets Pfizer.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think that in the case of the vaccines and, well, can I say that? I apologize, Charlemagne, if I'm not supposed to say
you
the
can
word.
say it. I just don't like
Okay.
saying the word because they weren't actually that.
Okay. Well, if it's the whole virus vaccine thing, I see that from my point of view, from my seat, I see that as an example of the interests of the two classes converging and them working together. Maybe this is just a point of experience, but watching these two classes clash in California for 20 years has led me to believe there's many cases, many circumstances in which the California government takes massive hits to like corporate profit and technological development in the name of this ideology that has nothing to do with advancing science or moving towards Ray Kurzweil's singularity. And that leads me to believe that the technocrats are the junior party. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my reading of it. And maybe this is just something that's very easy to believe if you grow up in near Silicon Valley in, the 2000s or the 1990s or the 80s. Like, I don't know if Yarvin grew up there, but he lived there.
I mean,
and
that's
so
fair enough,
maybe it's an illusion, but it very much looks like they're the junior party, and because they lose all the time.
Well, okay, so yeah, so from my perspective, the last 20 years, again, the biggest winners the military-industrial complex. No, obviously, but technology solutions or technology advancement is a close second or third. And from my vantage point, I've only seen them taking W's. And then the sort of like social cohesion and values that we would want to replicate are lost as a result. I mean, a good point would be, so back in the 90s and the early 2000s, we actually had brick and mortar bookstores like Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Borders.
Yeah.
Amazon ran them all out because it was more efficient. But then we lost all the social interaction with book readers.
No, I agree. I mean, but I feel like I might be, I don't want to be nitpicking, but the political class likes the decline in social cohesion. It benefits them, just like the lockdowns benefited.
Well, but it also benefits the technological class, because now you have to invent a technological solution that was once formerly used by a human or an animal.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's a symbiotic relationship, certainly.
No, it's
And
no. Now, again, I'm not so naive as to think that everything the government wants and everything that they want is the same, but they agree enough on, for maybe independent reasons, that disrupting social cohesion, what Emil Durkheim called anomie, is in their interest. They're both ratchets for anomie.
Let's put another steel plate on the tech industry here. I think one thing that we can say in Moldbug's defense is, well, what he's basically saying is if you put Silicon Valley in charge of the country, then things would go well. But that's not what happened. So we can say that, okay, what we can say basically is that you didn't put Silicon Valley in charge of the country, and then things went poorly because they're just getting managed by the same irresponsible oligarchs who were managing them when Moldbug was writing, right? So in a way,
yeah,
we're not actually talking about what he suggested, because he wasn't saying that like tech is just going to be unequivocally good. He's saying you need to put us in charge, and then okay, well that didn't happen, right? So in some sense, we're not actually talking about what his recommendation was because it didn't happen.
Well, okay. Let's sort of isolate then on who are leading, because he talks a lot about corporations and the market incentives, and then the state and state incentives. But one of the implications of the cathedral, and one of the things that we've all observed, is there's a revolving door. McNamara ran Ford and worked in the Johnson administration and ran the World Bank. Wolfowitz had a similar track record. So, in what sense can you even say that these are different people managing the world differently? They're the same people.
you mean like the core State Department people, Department of Defense McNamara types?
Well, no, like the people running the Fortune 500 companies are the people running the State Department. McNamara. He ran Ford and then he ran the State Department.
Well, he was an executive, he was a vice president of Ford, certainly, right?
Yeah. But the point is, given that these people are all on the same team, the same club, the Brahmins, he exaggerates the distinction between their incentives. If you're in the corporate world or you're in the business world, the political sphere of government or the corporate world of business, because they have this higher class loyalty, the Brahmins, then they're gonna act over and above those incentives, because we see a lot of times that again, when they are the same people, I don't see the distinction.
Yeah, I think
I agree with you here, but sorry, Lemon, did you want to take it, or
I
let me
think,
say it.
Yeah, you go ahead.
I mean, Todd, I kind of want to agree with you, but what keeps these groups of people are radically different people, and they don't communicate with each other very much. What keeps them in line is this sort of dispersed ideology that's best analogized to a secular religion. That's what keeps them aligned. I mean, McNamara, you're right, totally right about that individual, but he's an exceptional case. For the most part, these worlds are a little bit separated, except through the avenues of higher education, which is where this religion was developed and where it comes from. What keeps them aligned is an aligning ideology and aligning moral religious worldview, not sort of some kind of larger apparatus run through like the World Bank or something like that.
Yeah, I think we can definitely say that the startup CEOs and capitalists of the 90s and all its tech boom were certainly of a different class than the pre-existing like McNamara types, but they never were actually really in power because of the financial power behind them. And then again, they ultimately held the same beliefs as the rest of the oligarchs anyway, so ultimately it kind of didn't matter. But I do think we can actually make a distinction that there was a sort of unique type of entrepreneur that existed and came out of Silicon Valley, that you could look at optimistically, as Moldbug did. I mean, when he talks about the CEOs ought to, the government ought to be run how a CEO runs their company, he's thinking about the startup CEO.
Well, he's thinking about the startup CEO that has like no ideological oversight, that just wants to get the job done, not sort of like the advanced developed CEO that's surrounded by oligarchs that are feeding them like ideology from the universities, which is eventually what happens to most of these systems.
Yeah, so a couple points. One is, I don't have all the names at my fingertips right now, but in the documentary Food Inc., which is one of the documentaries about factory farming in their 2008, there is this revolving door between regulators and then being appointed from the businesses that they're supposed to regulate. So specifically, they're focusing on the food industry. And all these regulators that were supposed to be EPA are now being hired from the corporate sector. And this was during the Bush administration. But I've seen data from Clinton and then data from Obama. I mean, they're literally regulating themselves. They've gotten into those positions to make sure that the government doesn't do any antitrust stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm 100%.
Yeah. Now, the other thing is, I think, I don't know how to bridge this right now, because there's a sort of, I think, a level of analysis difference where you are looking at it from a certain perspective that I don't believe anymore. And the perspective that I'm coming from, I'm still in the process of building. If you watch...
Well, what do you see that... I'm curious. I don't know the answer to this question. What do you see that perspective as?
So looking at how the modern world, I think the single most distinctive element of the modern world is that it's an age of machines.
Can you come again? What was that?
I think the most distinctive element of the modern world is that it's the age of machines. So, for example, Ernst Jünger calls technology the metaphysics of our age. So, that I forget, I think it was his book on workers. But and so I'm like, okay, well, if that's that's the fundamental thing, right? This is all of these governments, to the extent that they have to engage in technological development to remain competitive with each other, all become more alike than not, because there's a homogenation property of technology, which I go into, which Shaka Lul goes into, and I've been hitting him quite heavily on my channel, which is too much to get into now. But broadly speaking, this homogenization is the result of not just states, but also private actors at corporations, all trying to remain competitive in this new environment. And it's leading to increased homogenization out of necessity for interfacing with each other. Because if you don't progress technologically fast enough, you're not able to integrate with these other people, and then you get left behind. And as we get further and further along, I guess we'll call this accelerationism, you then reach a crisis point. And which way that goes is the whole RL accelerationist debate, which I don't want to get into right now. But I think we're moving in that direction. And so all of these people are, even if they come from different classes, different groups, they're all converging on a similar pattern of behavior out of necessity as this technological process continues.
Sure. I mean, I see this many times, though. The managerial revolution, which is what it sounds like you're describing, is not exactly the same thing as wokeness. They're kind of being driven from the same area of the country, but they're, again, not to sound like a broken record, they're two very distinct groups of people who are pushing these things, and they're at conflict a lot.
Well, sure. And so again, I'm not discounting the state as an actor or the deep state. I'm not discounting individuals who believe certain secular religions. All of those are a part of the question, or part of explaining this. But I think what you end up having is this kind of problem where this is something I've noticed with a lot of like normie cons, normie conservatives. They'll be in what we might call the petite bourgeoisie, the middle class, and they'll be like, well, if only those higher ups played fair, then we wouldn't be losing. And it's like, bro, they rigged the game. Like, they're never going to play fair. Wake up, So they take this overly case by case individual basis of analysis, and they fail to see the bigger pattern that these people who are screwing them over time and time and time again, banks, the larger corporations that run them out, are working together in concert in this larger pattern that they just refuse to see.
Yeah, I agree with that, I guess.
Cool.
I want to try and segue us into another area, if we can, because I feel like we've kind of beaten the Silicon Valley programmer stuff to death. But one problem with the whole line of thought is that at the time, Yarvin was saying, okay, this is a long shot and it's not going to happen, but you should put my class of people in charge because we'll run things better. The problem with even thinking about this now is this class doesn't even exist anymore, right? There is no more Silicon Valley like tech startup super CEO. Steve
They
Jobs
do. They have all their brains written by Berkeley, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's not the same phenomena as it was when Moldbug was really into it. I guess is what I'm saying. So it's like
in the 90s, they were much more independent thinkers. Like,
right.
They would have all sorts of
it doesn't
crazy
even
ideas.
matter it doesn't even matter anymore, like, the answer to this question in some sense, because there is no 90s aughts class of tech startup people to put in charge. It's a different type of person now. So what Moldbug is actually recommending in his essays is no longer achievable uh, in any sense, right? At least you could say when he at
Yeah.
the time it was like a long shot that, you know, the mythical king of the planet would like read his blog and then put his guys in charge. But
Well,
there's no.
you do see echoes of that in Elon Musk, though. Like he's probably the last little.
Mhm.
You know, you can see what Yarvin is talking about and how it's distinct from the rest of the crowd in the difference that he embodies. The difference between him and the previous administrators at Twitter is that's exactly the contrast that Yarvin is talking about in attitude.
So Todd, what else would you like to talk about, or what can we segue into? Obviously, there's no way we can get through everything in one stream.
Sure,
But
sure. Well, I think this is relevant more than tangentially so. He talks about, with regards to formalism, with regards to politics, we're shifting back to the political. He's like, well, look, with power, well, okay, it's not clear who he's talking to when he says power ought to be seen transparently. On the one hand, it sounds like he's talking to us. But then later stuff he writes, like you can only lose the culture war, he sounds like he's talking to us, dissident dark elves and then elves. And he is talking to elves sometimes because he does write, you know, the open letter to an open-minded progressive. But so as an analysis of power, this is where I disagree. Power doesn't want to be clear. Power wants to be obscure, but only to a limit, right? Because if you're too obscure, then you're making decisions in fantasy land and then your empire falls. But a good example of this is the mafia. In the early 1900s, Giuseppe Morello developed the title Capo di Capi, the boss of bosses, which led to a power struggle where these guys whacked each other off. He was whacked off by Joe Masseria, who was then whacked by Salvatore Maranzano. So then what happened? Well, Lucky Luciano takes over and it's like, there's no boss of bosses. He goes full, you know, he says, we're just going to have the families and we're going to have this collegial relationship so that we can all make money together. And it's like, as soon as you have this one guy at the top, everybody's gunning for him.
So are you leading this into like a criticism of his monarchism?
Right, because it's an analysis of power. The people who actually hold the power don't want to be seen as the people holding the power.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
then who is formalism for? Is it for us or for them or for someone else? Because
it's for okay, well, go on with your question.
No, my main point is this is not an analysis. This is not, in my mind, a correct analysis of power. Power does not want to be clearly delineated up to one man. The one man holding it wants to obfuscate. Hence why you have, you know, court theater, all these, whether it's the ancient emperors of Rome, you know, with their theaters and gladiatorial games and whatnot.
Certainly the people in power.
Charlie said that would happen.
Yeah.
He trucked that for a
job
bit.
at I think I cut out.
Yeah, you did cut out there. Can you repeat that?
That was inevitable. So certainly the people in power now don't want to be seen because they're doing a terrible job and it would have bad consequences for them. The theoretical efficient executive from Silicon Valley who did a really good job would be perfectly happy being seen in power. In fact, he would want to be seen as being in power because he's doing such a good job. So within Moldbug's model, you could see why power would want to be seen because it would be seen running things much better than the previous regime.
But see, though, he's not actually the power holder. The power holder is the shareholders, which actually run this like a democracy by voting on.
No. I would. This is.
No.
Yeah, I think this is a meaningful distinction. There's a distinction between sort of being able to manage and being able to sort of judge or veto the executive position. This is something that is respected very much inside modern corporations. And, you know, my friend Black Horse was saying this, you know, he's in our circles. I think most people know Black Horse in these circles. You know, this whole idea of formalism, this is something that is very relevant from corporate administration. There needs to be clear ideas of who's responsible for what area of work, and that needs to go all the way up to the top. And to the extent that that's broken, the corporation is going to start bleeding money. And you can see it in a corporation. So I don't see formalism as like a tool for maintaining power. It's more just how do we get the government to actually work? And if the power is not held by the people who actually, are understood to hold it, then that creates a problem where corruption is naturally going to flow in.
Okay, so there's I guess two ways we could subdivide this, right? On the one hand, exoterically, the one holding the power doesn't want to be seen as the one holding the power because people are going to gun for him. But esoterically, inside the corporation or inside the kingdom, he's going to at least presumably want an actual dossier of who does what, but that never leaves his bedroom. That kind of thing. But it's not clear what Moldbug is talking about.
Well, I mean, I think I mean, from a corporate point of view, it's very clear what he's talking about, right? For me, if I to take something that we can dissect clearly, if we want to come up with historical examples, I mean, I'm thinking, the Merovingian divide, where at some point the Carolingians were in charge before they actually took the throne. And this created horrible corruption because there is this whole sort of pantomime of an aristocracy of the Merovingians that had virtually no power. And this is a huge crisis until they just got rid of the Merovingians altogether.
Well, yeah, but we also have a power of identified power. So over 20 Eastern Roman emperors died prematurely under unnatural causes of murder and suspicious circumstances. That could have been avoided had they been a little more in the shadows.
I wouldn't tolerate that as an underling from. I guess that's the caveat, right? There is a reason why more kings didn't do this. Is that I don't think that a nobility would accept being ruled by a shadow king.
It probably wouldn't. But then the trap is everybody guns for the king. I mean, you can look at the War of the Roses. The House Plantagenet just killed itself off.
Yeah, but the solution to that was a strong king, not to have a shadow king that was like, ruling England from the Isle of Man or something like that, right?
Well, but that's just kind of the course of monarchies. I mean, you start off with a few strong kings, and then they gradually become mediocre and terrible. That process happens in a monarchy just as much as it happens in the United States.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure how to actually really bring this to like criticizing unqualified reservations, because it's like, yeah, a monarchy system, the CEO monarchy could degrade, and I'm sure Yarvin would agree. I mean, he's just saying like this would be a way better way to run things now, because right now they're basically being run as badly as they possibly could, and we need to fix that now and not necessarily in perpetuity. So like, how can we really like bring this home?
Yeah, transparency is something that is demanded by the that should be demanded by the employees and by the stakeholders. It is not something that naturally occurs. Bureaucracies naturally try to obscure themselves. So I don't think there's necessarily a disagreement here. But they don't, because no self-respecting noble is going to serve under a shadow king or should want to, and no self-respecting stakeholder, whether it's the clergy, would want to issue orders to a shadow king, because of all the problems that I've mentioned over the course of the stream, and that they probably come from Pareto or something like that, right? But there's a problem with obscured power, and this is it, right? And so this is something that has to be demanded from a system, not that we can expect a system to naturally generate.
Well, I agree, right? But the over the years, as I've heard, Moldbug popularizes distill Moldbug down. They would always say, this guy understands the nature of power. Now, again, that's a very broad statement, and you could say from what perspective. But having read probably over half of 2007's articles, I don't think he does have a good understanding of power. Because, yeah, from our point of view, yeah, we'd want absolute transparency so we, the people, could judge on what's going on. But from the point of view of the people that hold power itself, because there's two arguments Moldbug's been making all the way up from 2007 until you can only lose the culture war. He's making an argument to quote us hobbits, and he's making an argument to quote the elves. And he's saying the same thing to both, that clearly defined power is good. But that's not good for the elves. The elves don't want the clearly defined power because they want to be in the shadows so they don't get targeted.
No, but Yarvin believes that there are just, first of all, I don't think us hobbits I think one of the big problems with that stupid hobbits and elves episode, it wasn't clear who was a hobbit and who was an elf. I think if you're talking about politics and you're deeply invested in it, you're not a hobbit. And I think that's the Steelman way to. I hate to always be like, people are making fun of me, calling me the blacksmith. And the but I mean, like, that's my job here, right? To steelman Yarvin. So we're not just being.
That's why you're here.
But, yeah, that's why I'm here, right? So, but like the steelman way to view this, right? Are there people who are interested in politics and are willing to sacrifice for it? Us being here and having these conversations and dedicating the time we do to write about these things makes us not hobbits. The problem is that the majority of the opposition to the regime as we know it comes from people that really don't want to dedicate themselves to dealing with the questions of power. And I don't know. I mean, like, from my perspective, that makes sense. Yarvin's idea of like the dark elves or whatever, that's a horrible analogy, and I hate having to use it, but I'm forced to. Like, is that there's a conflict inside the realm of natural sort of elites that can hold power and reign as hypothetically could reign as an oligarchy. So by virtue of sort of engaging in this, we're no longer being hobbits.
Yeah, sure. This is kind of weird because, again, the analogies are really bad. When he's talking,
it's terrible.
Again, I really hate that essay. I don't want to defend it, but but he's talking about like the MAGA people who were in the Capitol, right? When he's saying, "Hey, hobbits, please stop effing things up for us dark elves." I don't think he would necessarily say we're the hobbits. I think we're more or less the people doing the things that he thinks ought to be done in some sense. I mean, obviously we're a lot further from power than Moldbug, but yeah, I guess to try and defend him as much as possible, he's saying, don't hold the these rallies and sort of mess everything up and trigger power to start scrutinizing us in ways we would rather than not. And there's definitely those of us who would rather power not scrutinize us, right? So that's really what he was saying. Maybe.
Sure.
He had too few categories is sort of the problem, and they sort of bleed over with each other. Like, I don't think hobbits is like everyone on the right wing, but then again, he didn't make enough categories for that to really be clear.
Well, I just want to say before we move on, since Dave is now officially the blacksmith, if you remember the end of your problem with nerd culture, Dave, when you wanted to have like real authentic LARPing, you're the dwarven blacksmith in your own trad conclusion to that series.
Reforge the Narsil, the shattered blade of Mulma.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Try to piece together the pieces that were shattered by that dark elf essay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. It's gonna be a long night if I try to do that.
I know one thing you wanted to bring up, Moldbug. Not Moldbug, Charlemagne. If you still want to bring it up, is the fact that Moldbug is now being promoted by the media. And that should be a red flag.
Well, is he though?
Well, he's in Vanity Fair, and
okay. Well, so are the good old boys for that, man. I'm pretty sure that they're not some kind of controlled opposition.
That's fair. I don't have all the articles in front of me. I wouldn't say he's controlled opposition. I always just say approved opposition. I think it's become somewhat of apparent. I think that in terms of edgy politics, the Yarvanite crowd has kind of become the approved opposition. Maybe not fully yet, but it's clearly trending in that direction, right? We've seen a lot of articles. They're not praising him, but you don't get an article in like a major newspaper that's not just outright attacking you. Yarvin is kind of viewed as like a curiosity, which isn't something you'd see when they were covering like the alt-right, for example. So I don't want to say that like the enemy has power to just like determine who's good and who's bad, and like if you get in Vanity Fair or the Atlantic or whatever, like, oh, you're just bad. But there's a pattern happening where it seems like Yarvin's sort of not necessarily positions, but his milieu of people is sort of being adopted as like the new acceptable opposition. So that's just kind of a view I have. I mean, I don't know.
That's correct. The problem is our disagreements are also subtle. It feels like we're doing surgery here. I mean, you're right, but to me, that's sort of a mixture of an opportunity and a danger on one, right?
Yeah.
What's happening, obviously, is that the old school Normicon National Review is completely discredited itself. And they're casting around for something that is plausible but less scary. And Moldbug, I'm not going to mince words here, mainly because of how he looks and sounds, is very not threatening. My wife thinks he's devolving into a tree ant, to borrow the the token analogies, since Yarvin is fond of using them. But yeah, I mean, he's not threatening, right? So it's both an opportunity and a risk for us, right?
Yeah. I mean, also, of course, there was the Orrin McIntyre tweet that went viral on, I think, Tucker Carlson. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody's going to want to say then that Orrin McIntyre is the approved op. I don't know. Maybe he is. But, how far do you want to go with that analogy, I guess, is what I'm saying. But I think Moldbug, though, let me put it this way.
Maybe not approved. I would say maybe acceptable opposition. Yeah. I don't know.
I don't think that Moldbug was entirely honest with us, the readers, with his intentions in 2007. And 2022 and 2023 made them far more clear. And I think, and I have to ask myself, why was Moldbug not clear earlier? Was this something just doesn't smell right?
That's definitely fair. I mean, in some sense, his new articles are a lot more clear in his perspective on things. I think that's why he brought out his class divide much more starkly in that Dark Elf article, for example. As far as like whether or not he was dishonest, I'm not sure if that part is fair. I mean, maybe you could elaborate a little more on the sort of
the way he writes in 2007. He's writing to a general audience. Yeah, he does have some progressive he writes to specifically, and we know that because of specific article titles. But he's writing to a general audience, which could be fellow programmers, which could be just, online 90s, 80s, or 2000s kids who are, not even involved in computer industry, but like to be online. And then he takes his about face and is like, know your place, serfs. You're not even in the exalted halls of the elves, and I want to lead the Dark Elf revolution against, I guess, Biden. And I'm like, well, that's a totally different tone than what you were giving us in 2007.
I guess I don't see them as being so different. I guess to me in 2007, it sounds like Yarvin's is throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. By 2022, he has a much more solidified view of things. And he's completely given up on any pretense that populism could even lead off some kind of reactionary pushback. And, I'm going to follow AA in this one. I mean, populism does seem to be dead right now.
Well, yeah, at the moment, but I don't think populists were his audience in 2007.
I'm having a hard time remembering that early, and I seem to remember him thinking that populism could, spark something that would turn into a monarchy or something. This populism was never, populists were never his target demo for sure.
There's an article that I don't remember the name of where I'm getting a deja vu that he did throw some shade at the idea of populism. This was criticizing the Bush era system. So I don't think he was ever necessarily a populist, but I think he was trying to poach from people in that group, or at least normies.
I mean, Sam Francis, I could call him a populist, right?
I guess I'm not familiar enough with Sam Francis.
Okay, maybe I'm wrong, but I'll have to. I'm not either. I'm just going off sort of the essays I've read of his.
Well, I guess on this issue of populism, if we put ourselves in Moldbug's mind and his view of the world, the sort of MAGA populist crowd is a lot more disgusting to a California progressive, which he is. I mean, he calls himself a progressive. It's a lot more disgusting than the neocons are. At least the neocons have some class, right? But the populism of today has this icky factor to it that Moldbug's people just cannot really stand, deep in their bones. So I think to the extent that that's
true of almost everyone who comes from Blue State.
Yeah.
Right. So, but yeah, the idea that, again, not to get into style, but the fact that you're an engineer, Dave, but I think you'd appreciate this sentiment. Mm-hmm. I like things to be very, because I'm a philosopher, but I like to have things clearly defined, clearly delineated with a step-by-step process, syllogism, a flowchart, showing what leads to what, so then I can look at what you're saying and then make head or tail of it. When somebody intentionally doesn't do that, I'm just implicitly suspicious.
Fair. I think that Moldbug's early writings in particular were a lot of just kind of random ideas strung together semi-coherently. They hadn't kind of fallen out into something that was more easy to see, I suppose, right?
Right. So
this is a huge problem, though. I mean, like, I talk about this all the time. I mean, there's no way putting Red America in charge of Blue America is virtually impossible. Blue America will never accept them as leaders. Yes. And I say that being a Blue American that recognizes that my own homeland is this like spiritually corrupt wasteland that needs to be destroyed.
Well,
but
also,
I mean, like, it's just, even with my understanding of that, I still deep in my bones don't feel that Red America has the right to do that.
Well, even though I think that there's no idea how to govern. Like, they don't.
Well, he has no idea how to govern it, but it's something intuitive, and like pointing that reality out, even if it's wrong, is like that has to be acknowledged, right?
Yeah, I think his big reveal in the Coriolanus article, which is I think from 2021, of him being a traitor to his class, or at least him perceiving himself as that, he did leave a pretty big hint, which to my knowledge so far nobody's picked up on. He has a whole article ragging on Dante as a traitor to Florence, siding with the Holy Roman Empire against the Pope and the Guelph Ghibelline Civil War. And okay, that's whatever. And a couple articles later, he mentions that he wants to be leader of the world or leader of a corporation with an AI called Beatrice. And I'm like,
hey, I'll have you know that Dante was a white Guelph, damn it. No, go ahead.
No, but the point is,
I'm nitpicking.
I think even there, Moldbug was letting us know what his true aspirations were, because he does his whole screed against Dante, which really isn't a screed, because he then sort of through the back door says, oh, by the way, guys, I'm Dante, because I'm talking to Beatrice, who's an AI instead of a disembodied spirit. So I think there is probably some sort of like breadcrumb trail of his, like, make me the king of the dark elves that we saw in his You Can Only Lose the Culture War. But I think it was subtle.
Well, I'm not so sure I follow, Todd. So you think he's trying, like he's personally trying to?
Well, whatever his goal is, he wants to lead something. There's a lot of resentment in his writings about not being in leadership positions, and he has this big attack on Dante, which turns out really isn't attack, because it's a sort of like implicit reveal. Because then he talks about talking to this AI Beatrice, which I think connects him to Dante.
Oh, I really don't think that Mulgo wants to manage anything.
You don't think so?
I think that he just wants to sit back and opine on things. I think that he got burnt by trying to manage Urbit and tech companies. I don't think he wants to be a manager. Maybe I'm misreading it. I could be wrong, but
okay. All I'm saying is just from what I've read, that's what it sounds like to me.
I think he's really tickled at the idea of the people who are actually running things, as any philosopher would be, like reading his ideas, being inspired by his ideas, putting his ideas into practice. But I don't think he actually wants to be doing that. There's probably a cabal of people we can infer from his Dark Elves essay that is actually doing that. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so butthurt about it. There must be some quote unquote Dark Elves doing something that he approves of, that he views the quote unquote hobbits of messing up.
Yeah, well, possibly Peter Thiel, because there was an article put out like 10 years ago.
Moldbug, sorry, I must have cut out. We don't even know that Moldbug necessarily views himself as a dark elf. I mean, one of the things he mentions about the dark elves is they're doing things secretly, and Moldbug is certainly not doing things in any way secretly. He's just completely open. So I'm not even sure that he would lump himself necessarily into like a category of potential power wielder.
Right. Well, the when I did the video on that, there was something that I read which to my interpretation sounded like he did want to be the leader. I don't have that at my fingertips now, but maybe one of the people he's talking about is Peter Thiel. The libertarian Robert Drowarty did an article a few years back showing that there was a connection between Moldbug, Peter Thiel, and Milo Yiannopoulos, for what that's worth.
I mean, Peter Thiel has his fingers everywhere. That's just, I mean, he's a venture capitalist, right? That's what they do all the time. They just like, they just, they've spread a little bit of money around, and so they can claim that they were there when on the ground floor, and they play all sides of the game, right?
Well, sure, but even if you play all sides of the game, you don't just pick anyone necessarily. You pick people you think that can be either useful or winners.
I feel like Silicon Valley venture capitalists just like they're so worried about losing out on the next big thing, they'll throw money at absolutely ridiculous projects. But
well, yeah,
you know, so I wouldn't make much about Peter Thiel being in any given place, because I'm pretty sure that his attitude is just literally plant seeds and hope one of them takes root. I think it's a scattershot approach, and if you sort of read too much into that, you're going to be tracing lines in areas that are, I don't think, necessarily going anywhere, right?
Yeah, sure. So you had asked a little while ago, Charlene, if there's anything else that I wanted to talk about. We've already been going for an hour and 40 minutes. I think the substance of, I mean, obviously the Moldbug matrix is like over 40 hours. I can't get into all that, but I think the substance has been communicated. So unless you have any other questions, I think we've satisfactorily dealt with Moldbug.
I want to kind of pose something. What do you see coming out of sort of the series, Todd? And I everyone thinks I'm like the world's biggest Moldbug apologist, even though I've been criticizing him for the better half of a year. I'm very aware of Moldbug's big like idiocies and his big blind spots. But what do you hope from people who are sort of more in the NRX sphere that you see prominently in podcasts like Alex Kashuta? What do you really want us to take? What direction do you want us to see? What should we be looking to? I mean, everyone's aware that Moldbug's got problems. Well, what should we really be trying to constructively build towards that you think we missed?
Right. So what I'd like to accomplish with the Moldbug matrix is, one, point out not only so first of all, there are people that already, as you correctly identified, disagree with aspects of Moldbug. But the points that I'm going to criticize and point out, one, I don't think have been done before, or if they have been, I'm not aware of it. And then second of all, because again, while certainly Moldbug has lost a lot of his sheen, I still think there's a Moldbug haunted space in this area where I think that his analysis and others, but he's the first one I started with, I can provide better answers to. So now, we didn't talk about this tonight, but I have a parallel series on problems of technological civilization. And for anybody who's interested, on Monday the 20th, I will be doing a discussion with Charles Haywood, to discuss our different views on technology.
Wow. Okay, that's great. I'm a huge Haywood fan.
So yeah, it's to give a new set of critiques of Moldbug, but then to also attempt to produce a superior model to explain the problems that we all observe.
But would you what would you advise? Would you say like, okay, well, you should be looking more at what thinkers that already exist, or what ideas that already are kind of in these spheres do you think we should be kind of looking to look towards in replacement of what we were saying is like the Moldbug haunted right? I mean, there's a gap there, and that needs to be filled. And I don't want to say like, you're not going to move on to fill it, but there probably is something that's approximate, right? That's a little bit closer.
So there's a whole series of authors that I would like to, some of them of which are already making some inroads into this space, but and others that haven't, that I think give a better analysis. Because right now online, there seems to be this 20th century malaise of both left and right. They're framing these terms and 20th century concepts that just seem less and less relevant now, especially as we see the global homogenization of technological society.
Can you give me an example? What do you mean? So I'm just
curious. Sure.
I'm not pulling the stream, but I am curious.
No, sure. So, for example, on the right, less now than before, but there's always been that strong libertarian presence and we all know the specific kind of analysis that libertarians bring to the question of whatever we're talking about, which despite my own personal disagreements with that, I think is increasingly less relevant in the new situation we're finding ourselves in. And the left still wants to think that, we're dealing with, the robber barons of the 1890s when we're dealing with international elite of tech oligarchs. I mean, it's just a mismatch to the situation we're in.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
And so the thinkers that I think that help us understand this better are Jacques Ellul and his On Technique, Ivan Illich and Rivers North of the Future, C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. That's an enduring classic.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Obviously, Tolkien, he has this very organic, literary, critical dealing with technology, especially Isengard and the Scouring of the Shire.
Do you mean allegorically, or is I'm not super familiar with Tolkien's work outside of his fiction?
No, in his fiction, because in his fiction, because in his fiction, as you like to say, Dave, stories often communicate ideas better than just a syllogism, and so Tolkien is a really good way of showing people the dangers here. Treebeard famously says that Saruman has a mind of gears turning in his head, which is contrasted with Treebeard and the hobbits, who are organic and defending something real. Baudrillard, I've used a lot of Baudrillard lately, and I think a lot of these they're hard to classify because obviously Baudrillard is somewhat on the left, but Jacques Ellul and Illich are not really on the left or the right in a normal political sense that we talk about. They seem to be transcending those, because what they're criticizing is something that I think is a framework that transcends left and right, which is this new hyperreal edifice of the machine.
Okay, that's excellent. I'll have to check those out. What book of Jacques Ellul's do you recommend again?
Well, the main one is On Technique. Now, I've not read it completely, but I've read relevant sections for the episodes that I do. I use it as a research source, and he's excellent.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been watching that series. It's a very good series that people should go check out. And I actually have a browser tab up with that book because I've been meaning to get into Ellul myself. So yeah, listeners ought to read The Technological Society by Jacques Ellul. Based on what I've seen Todd cite from it, this is pretty essential work, and I think it'll interest a lot of people. So of course. So I think this has been a good discussion overall. Hopefully, it helped you, Todd, sort of get more perspective on what the Moldbug Haunted Right actually thinks about Moldbug, and your series again. I hope people actually go watch it after listening to this, because obviously we can't address everything you bring up in your series, but we at least have some more context now. And to reiterate, you're reading every single Moldbug.
I lost him.
Yeah, we lost him. We'll have to wait.
Okay. It's unfortunate because we're wrapping up.
I know.
Yeah, I cut out. I found your series on Moldbug, Escaping the Moldbug Vatrix, very, very helpful. I think everyone should go really listen to it. I mean, listen to the whole thing if you have time. If not, just go tune into whatever live stream you're doing at the moment. I think if this is useful work, I always like going back and sort of questioning, some of our prior foundations, and just making sure that we really understand our own cultural history from the right. So yeah, I think you're doing great stuff.
Well, thank you, Charlemagne. The only other thing I guess I'll just say to Dave to sort of just further clarify is, I think that the failures that we've seen on both the political right and the political left to achieve their stated goals over the last 60, 70 years points to, no, by the left, I mean the economic left, right? Everything's been deregulated and there's no socialism, there's no unions.
Yeah.
Is the result of a bigger force at work that neither one was looking at the appropriate scale to observe. And I think that these thinkers, when they critique technology as a whole, are rising to that higher scale to fill in what these two clashing ideologies fail to account for.
Well, that's excellent, Todd, and I really appreciate the book recommendations. So,
thank you, Dave.
Yeah. Excellent. I'll look forward to see what comes out of the later part of your series as well.
Thanks.
Cool. All right. With that, I guess we can go ahead and close it out. So thanks to the two of you for coming on. This was pretty excellent, I think, and hopefully the subscribers are happy that I've actually uploaded something now. Perhaps next time, maybe after you get through another 15 or so episodes of your series, we can have Closington on or something too, or other people. There are plenty of people we get on to discuss this.
I highly recommend that, and I'd like to be on too because I'd like to see how this is sort of a dialectic that's going to need to be actively synthesized, as I'm fond of saying.
Hegelian Dave.
Yeah, I know. I don't. I've read Hegel, but I don't understand a lick of it. But this is me just
Oh
imposing
no,
my
no,
own-
I got it.
Sorry.
Dark Hegelian Dave. You're a dark Hegelian. Try
Dark.
that.
I'm a dark Hegelian. Yeah. That sounds pretty badass. I'm going to go with that one.
All right, the new Dark Hegelian Haunted Right. Let's go. Okay, so yeah, thanks guys. Thanks for everyone tuning in, listening, and I will see you guys, next time.
All right, bye.